There are books in history that carry weight, books that changed empires, shaped religions, and turned the course of human thought. And then there is the Necronomicon, a book so dangerous, so laden with cosmic horror and forbidden knowledge, that merely possessing a copy was said to mark a person for destruction. Today, we journey through the full story of the Necronomicon, its origins, its legendary author, its contents, its supposed powers, its dangers, and the remarkable way it crossed from fiction into something far more difficult to categorize. Welcome back, everyone, and if you are joining us for the first time, welcome. Before we begin, a small request. If you find value in this kind of deep mythological storytelling, please consider subscribing and following the channel, and it means everything for keeping this series alive. Now, with that said, let us begin. The Necronomicon entered written history not in the ancient world, not in some crumbling desert monastery, but in a modest American magazine. In 1922, a writer from Providence, Rhode Island, by the name of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, composed a short horror story called The Hound. The story was published in 1924 in the pulp magazine Weird Tales, and within its pages, Lovecraft made an almost casual reference, a brief mention of a forbidden book called the Necronomicon that the story's grave-robbing characters had used to guide their grim obsessions. It was, at that moment, little more than set dressing, a literary prop to lend atmosphere. Lovecraft had no way of knowing that this single, offhand detail would grow into one of the most elaborate and genuinely believed mythologies of the modern era. Lovecraft himself later explained where the name came from. In a letter written in 1937, the year of his death, he described the title's Greek components: nekros, meaning dead, nomos, meaning law or custom, and icon, meaning image. He translated the full title as an image of the law of the dead, a phrase that implies not a book of death itself, but a text that documents, maps, and illuminates the forces governing what lies beyond it. But within the mythology Lovecraft constructed, the book did not begin with that Greek title. He described it in his short essay History of the Necronomicon, written in 1927 and circulated privately among friends, as having originally been composed in Arabic under the title Al-Azif. The word Azif came from Arabic desert folklore, where it referred to the strange, droning sounds that insects made at night in the wilderness, sounds that Arab desert travelers believed were the voices of jinn and demons drifting through the darkness. The title Al-Azif, therefore, carried the meaning of the Book of the Demon Winds, or more loosely, that which is summoned by night sounds. It was a title that evoked not academic study, but something far more primal, the sensation of standing alone in a vast desert and hearing, from no identifiable direction, something that should not be there. Lovecraft chose to give the Necronomicon an author, a specific, named human being who had written it. This was a significant creative decision, because it grounded the mythology in biography, in history, and in the consequences that came with seeking knowledge that no human mind was designed to hold. The man Lovecraft named as the author of the Necronomicon was called Abdul Alhazred. Lovecraft referred to him consistently as the Mad Arab, and this epithet was not metaphorical. According to Lovecraft's History of the Necronomicon, Abdul Alhazred was born in the city of Sana'a, in what is now Yemen, though some later retellings of the legend place his birth in Damascus, Syria. He was said to have lived during the 8th century AD, placing him in the early Abbasid period of Islamic civilization, a time of genuine intellectual flourishing, when Baghdad was becoming the center of the known world's scholarship. Alhazred, however, was not interested in the scholarship of his era. He was interested in what lay beneath and behind it. From a young age, Alhazred was drawn to the ruins of older civilizations, places where something had existed before the world's current order, and where traces of that existence might still be found. Lovecraft described him in History of the Necronomicon as a great Arab poet who worshipped unknown entities, and as a man who had visited the ruins of Babylon, explored the catacombs beneath the ancient city of Memphis in Egypt, and, most significantly, spent 10 years living alone in the great southern desert of Arabia. That southern desert was known in Arabic tradition as the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, and it was, and remains, one of the largest and most inhospitable stretches of sand on Earth. In Lovecraft's mythology, it was also the location of a city so ancient it predated all human civilization. This was Iram, sometimes called the City of Pillars, a place mentioned in the Quran as a great and arrogant civilization destroyed by God, whose precise location was unknown. In Lovecraft's telling, Alhazred had found it, or found what remained of it beneath the sands, and in its ruins had discovered things that existed long before humanity. Those 10 years in the desert transformed Alhazred entirely. Lovecraft's mythology suggested that during this time, Alhazred came into contact with entities so ancient and so alien to human experience that they could not be categorized within any existing theological or philosophical framework. He did not find demons, as a medieval scholar might have understood them. He found something far older, forces that had no interest in humanity, no relationship with the divine hierarchies of any religion Alhazred knew, and no comprehensible motivation beyond their own vast and unfathomable existence. Alhazred became a worshipper of two specific entities, whom Lovecraft named Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu. These were not gods in any conventional sense. They were, within Lovecraft's mythology, what he called the Great Old Ones, cosmic beings of incomprehensible power who had inhabited the Earth in an age so distant that human history did not begin to reach it. They slept, or were imprisoned, or existed in a state beyond either sleep or wakefulness, waiting, and Alhazred, alone in the desert, had somehow reached them, or they had reached him. When he finally emerged from the empty quarter, he was brilliant, obsessive, and by any conventional standard, quite mad. He made his way to Damascus, the great Syrian city that served as a center of learning and commerce, and it was there, around the year 730 AD, that he composed the book that would become the Necronomicon. He called it, in Arabic, Al-Azif, and spent the remaining years of his life writing and compiling within it everything he had experienced, witnessed, and been told during his decade of isolation, and everything he could reconstruct from the ruins of Babylon and Memphis and Iram. Alhazred had no known spouse and no confirmed children in any version of the core Lovecraftian mythology. He was entirely consumed by his work and by the entities he worshipped, and is portrayed in every account as a solitary figure. His peculiar death, according to history of the Necronomicon, came in Damascus in the year 738 AD. In broad daylight, in a crowded marketplace in Damascus, Abdul Alhazred was seized by something invisible. There were witnesses. The crowd saw him stop walking, saw something take hold of him, and then, in front of many horrified onlookers, he was consumed, devoured. In seconds there was nothing left. No blood, no remains, only the spot where he had been standing and the screaming crowd around it. Lovecraft described this in History of the Necronomicon with deliberate vagueness. He did not name the entity responsible, but the implication was clear. Alhazred had spent his life writing about forces no human being should have approached, and those forces had, in the end, collected him. After Alhazred's death, the manuscript of Al-Azif did not vanish. It circulated, quietly, carefully, hand to hand among scholars, sorcerers, and the simply curious, through the libraries and private collections of the Islamic world. It was copied, recopied, and each transcription carried the risk of whatever had claimed its author. For more than 2 centuries, the Arabic manuscript drifted through the scholarly underground of the medieval world. Then, in 950 AD, a significant event occurred. A Greek scholar in Constantinople, Lovecraft named him Theodorus Philutus in History of the Necronomicon, obtained a copy of Al-Azif and translated it into Greek. During this translation, the book received the name by which it would become infamous. Philetus chose the Greek title Necronomicon, believing it captured the essential nature of what the text described. The translation was circulated in Constantinople, and, from there, spread gradually into the wider Greek-speaking scholarly world of the Byzantine Empire. The Greek Necronomicon survived for approximately 100 years. Then, in 1050 AD, the Patriarch Michael I, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, ordered the book destroyed. It was declared a work of heresy, an offense against God and creation, and copies that could be found were burned. The official record held that this suppression was complete. It was not. In 1228 AD, a monk known as Olaus Wormius obtained the surviving Greek text and translated it into Latin. This Latin edition was the most widely read and reproduced version of the Necronomicon in European history, and it became the foundation for all subsequent references to the book in Western scholarship, sorcery, and legend. It also attracted immediate attention from the Catholic Church. In the same year, 1228, Pope Gregory IX issued a formal condemnation of the Latin Necronomicon, ordering it suppressed and its copies destroyed. This made the Necronomicon one of the earliest formally banned books in European recorded history. The condemnation, however, was only partially effective. Copies of the Latin edition survived in private collections across Europe, often protected by the same wealthy and learned individuals who most wanted access to its contents. Two printed editions appeared in later centuries. One, a black-letter German edition, produced sometime in the 15th century, and another, an Italian printed edition, produced around 1567. Both were suppressed almost immediately upon their appearance, but not before copies escaped into private hands. Within Lovecraft's mythology, by the time of his stories, set in the early 20th century, genuine complete copies of the Necronomicon were extraordinarily rare. Lovecraft specified in History of the Necronomicon that only 5 copies were known to exist in the world at that time. One in the British Museum in London, though reportedly not made available to the general public. One at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. One at Harvard's Widener Library in Cambridge, Massachusetts. One at the library of the fictional Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, and one in a private collection whose location was not disclosed. The Vatican was also rumored to possess a copy locked away in its secret archives, but this was never confirmed even within the mythology. The question of what precisely the Necronomicon contained is one that Lovecraft answered only in fragments, deliberately so, since the conceit of his mythology was that the book was too vast and too dangerous to be summarized. But across his various stories, a picture emerged. The Necronomicon was simultaneously several things: a history, a theology, a cosmology, a ritual manual, and a cartography of spaces that human beings had never mapped. It documented the existence of the Great Old Ones, those ancient cosmic beings who had inhabited the Earth before any life that humans would recognize. It described their nature, their origins, their relationship to the fabric of space and time, and, most dangerously, the means by which they could be contacted, summoned, or communicated with. In the Dunwich horror, published in 1929, Lovecraft gave readers one of the most direct glimpses into the Necronomicon's content. A character in that story reads from the book a passage that described, in cosmological terms, the relationship between the Great Old Ones and humanity. The passage, written by Lovecraft and attributed to Alhazred within the fiction, spoke of how humanity was neither the first nor the last master of the Earth, and how forces existed in the universe that had preceded all known life and would outlast it. The implication was not evil in any human sense of that word. It was something more disturbing. The Great Old Ones did not hate humanity. They were simply so vast and so old and so fundamentally alien in their nature that humanity simply did not register. One of the most famous passages associated with the Necronomicon, a couplet that appeared in The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1926, was attributed directly to Alhazred within the story. Open quote, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die." Close quote. This couplet became perhaps the single most quoted line ever attributed to the fictional book, and it distilled the Necronomicon's central philosophical claim, that the ordinary rules of mortality and existence did not apply to the forces it described. The Great Old Ones were not alive in any human sense, and yet they were not dead. They existed in a state that the words life and death were simply insufficient to describe. The Necronomicon also reportedly contained star maps, cartographic records of regions of space that did not correspond to any star system known to astronomy. These maps within the mythology depicted the home dimensions and cosmic locations of the Great Old Ones, including Arlaya, a sunken city beneath the Pacific Ocean, where the entity Cthulhu rested in a kind of deathless sleep. The maps were said to be functional. They did not merely show where these places were, but suggested ways of reaching them, not physically, but through specific states of consciousness and certain ritual configurations. The rituals themselves constituted perhaps the most dangerous portion of the text. The Necronomicon reportedly described specific invocations, combinations of spoken words, geometric symbols, and physical arrangements that could open what the mythology called the angles. These were not physical doorways, but dimensional apertures, passages between the ordinary dimensions of experienced reality and the spaces where the Great Old Ones existed. The rituals required precise alignment with certain celestial configurations, specific material preparations, and in some accounts, sacrifices. They were not presented in the mythology as easy or reliable. They were presented as extraordinarily dangerous, requiring a level of knowledge and mental fortitude that few human beings had ever approached. Of all the legends directly connected to the Necronomicon in Lovecraft's mythology, the events described in the Dunwich Horror of 1929 stood as the most detailed account of what happened when the book's knowledge was actually applied. In that story, set in the decaying Massachusetts village of Dunwich, a woman named Lavinia Whatley gave birth to twin sons under circumstances that suggested the father was not human. One twin, Wilbur Whatley, appeared somewhat human, though wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. The other twin was hidden entirely, kept in the farmhouse, its existence concealed, and as years passed, its presence was felt rather than seen. Livestock disappeared, floors collapsed under tremendous unseen weight, and the farmhouse was expanded repeatedly to accommodate something that kept growing. Wilbur Whatley was recognized from childhood as exceptionally intelligent, and he was obsessed from an early age with the Necronomicon. His grandfather, Old Wizard Whatley, as the village called him, had an incomplete copy, and Wilbur spent years working from it, clearly executing some long-term plan. By the time he was an adult, though he aged at an accelerated rate, appearing much older than his years, he had exhausted the incomplete copy's usefulness and needed a complete edition. He traveled to Miskatonic University in Arkham, where the library held the Latin Necronomicon under lock and key, accessible only to faculty. He requested access. The librarian, Dr. Henry Armitage, granted him limited viewing, and what Armitage saw Wilbur reading and copying over the man's shoulder disturbed him profoundly. It was a passage describing the summoning of Yog-Sothoth, one of the Great Old Ones, and its purpose was clear. Armitage denied further access. What Wilbur needed was a complete version of a specific ritual, a ritual he intended to use to fully open a gate to Yog-Sothoth. He returned that night to steal the book. The library's watchdog attacked him, and Wilbur Whatley died from the injuries. But in dying, the mythology revealed what he truly was beneath his surface appearance, something that was only partially human, his father's nature showing in the impossibly alien structure of his body. His death did not stop what had already been set in motion. The other twin, the hidden, unseen thing that had been growing in the farmhouse for years, was released. It ravaged the surrounding countryside, invisible and enormous, and it was only through the Necronomicon itself that Dr. Armitage was able to find a counter-ritual, a banishment formula buried in the same pages that had been used to call it forth. He used it, and the creature was dissolved. But the lesson of the Dunwich Horror was explicit. The Necronomicon was not only a book of summoning. It contained within its pages both the keys that opened the cage and the keys that locked it again. The difficulty was that no human being could easily hold both sets of knowledge at once. Scholars who studied it, always with what they believed was sufficient caution, consistently underestimated what they were dealing with. Armitage survived the Dunwich horror, but the mythology made clear this was exceptional. The more common outcome for those who engaged deeply with the book was deterioration, intellectual, psychological, and sometimes physical. The Miskatonic copy was described in the mythology as showing its age in ways that defied easy explanation. It was old, of that there was no question. But it seemed, at times, to be more worn in certain sections than others, as though specific passages had been consulted far more frequently than the archive's visitor records would account for. As though in some way that the rational mind resisted acknowledging, the book was being read when no one was present. In Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, the Necronomicon appeared as one of several forbidden texts in the library of Joseph Curwen, a colonial-era figure in Providence who appeared superficially to be a prosperous merchant and amateur chemist, but was in reality engaged in practices drawn directly from the Necronomicon and related texts. Curwen had discovered, through a combination of the Necronomicon and alchemical traditions, a process for what the mythology described as the reconstitution of the dead. The essential principle, drawn from the book and from other sources, was that the essential salts of a living being, preserved under the right conditions, could be used to reconstruct that being. Curwen had spent decades collecting these salts from graves, and by implication, from individuals he had killed for the purpose. Through this process, he had reportedly achieved communication with, and temporary reconstitution of, figures from across history, ancient sorcerers, scholars, and entities whose knowledge he sought. The Necronomicon provided the theoretical framework for this. The sections of the text dealing with the relationship between physical matter and the forces governing existence beyond death gave Curwen a roadmap that no strictly scientific or conventional theological framework could have provided. When Curwen was eventually killed by a group of alarmed Providence citizens who had discovered what he was doing, the matter should have ended. It did not. His young descendant Charles Dexter Ward, obsessing over family history, discovered Curwen's papers and formulas generations later, reconstituted him, and was gradually replaced by him, Curwen's personality and will overtaking Ward's entirely. The Necronomicon was the through line that connected all of it. Without the knowledge in that book, none of what Curwen achieved or what he did to Ward would have been possible. Drawing together what the mythology establishes across all of Lovecraft's work and the broader tradition he inspired, the powers attributed to the Necronomicon were substantial and, within the fictional cosmology, essentially unique. The book was said to hold the power to summon or awaken the Great Old Ones. This was not a power that offered controlled outcomes. The mythology was explicit that no human being had ever successfully summoned one of these entities and retained both their sanity and their life. The Necronomicon also reportedly contained the power to open dimensional apertures, passages between the world of ordinary human experience and the spaces, dimensions, or states of being in which the Great Old Ones existed. These apertures were described as physical realities, capable of allowing passage in both directions, which is to say they were not merely a way for a summoner to reach outward, but a way for what lay beyond to reach inward. The book held knowledge of communication with the dead, or more precisely, with what persisted after death when certain conditions were met. Alhazred's text reportedly described states of existence between life and death, and methods of accessing intelligences or essences that remained in those states. The Curwen experiments, as described in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, were the most fully developed example of this power being applied. The Necronomicon also granted, to those who engaged with it seriously, a form of cosmic perspective, an awareness of the true scale and age of the universe, and humanity's position within it. Within the mythology, this was consistently presented not as enlightenment, but as a form of damage. The human mind was not built to process what the Necronomicon described. Those who tried to hold that knowledge often found that it restructured their priorities, their perceptions, and eventually their sanity in ways that made ordinary human life impossible to maintain. For all of its power, the Necronomicon was as dangerous, arguably more dangerous, to those who possessed it as to anyone else. The primary danger was madness. This was not metaphorical. Across every story in which the Necronomicon appeared, engagement with its contents was associated with progressive mental deterioration. Lovecraft's cosmology had a specific reason for this. The knowledge the book contained was genuinely incompatible with the architecture of the human mind. Brains built to navigate the scale of human social life were simply not equipped to process the cosmological realities the Necronomicon described. The deterioration was not a curse in any traditional magical sense. It was more like cognitive overload without any off switch. The rituals within the book were extraordinarily difficult to execute correctly, and the cost of errors was severe. An imperfect ritual could summon something that the practitioner had no means of controlling, dismissing, or surviving. The mythology did not present this as a rare edge case. It presented it as the typical outcome for anyone who attempted the book's more advanced sections without decades of preparation that, in itself, typically caused significant psychological damage long before any ritual was attempted. Within the mythology, there were recognized defenses against what the Necronomicon described and summoned, but none of them were reliable. The most prominent was the Elder Sign, a specific geometric symbol that appeared in multiple Lovecraft stories and was said to predate even the Great Old Ones themselves. The Elder Sign was described as capable of repelling or containing the entities the Necronomicon could summon, but its effectiveness was never absolute. It was a lock, and the mythology acknowledged that locks could be broken by things that had existed long enough to find every weakness in every barrier ever built. The book itself was also said to possess a quality that resisted destruction. Within the mythology, copies that were burned reportedly resurfaced. Translations that were officially suppressed somehow survived. This was not presented as supernatural in any traditional magical sense, but rather as a consequence of the knowledge itself, as though the content of the book had a gravity that drew copies into existence, or drew surviving copies toward people who would preserve them, regardless of what institutional authorities attempted to do. In 1977, 4 decades after Lovecraft's death, a real book appeared in New York City. A physical, published volume that presented itself not as fiction, not as literature, but as an authentic ancient text, the genuine Necronomicon, of which Lovecraft had reportedly been an unknowing channeler rather than an inventor. This book, known as the Simon Necronomicon, after its anonymous editor who used the pseudonym Simon, became one of the best-selling occult books in American publishing history. It was presented as a text discovered through obscure channels in New York's Byzantine Catholic community, a manuscript of Sumerian origin that had somehow made its way to the United States. Scholars of both Lovecraft and Sumerian studies examined it and were, nearly unanimously, unconvinced. The book drew heavily and, to a degree, accurately from genuine Sumerian mythological texts, including the Enuma Elish, the Great Babylonian creation epic, and mythology surrounding the god Marduk and the primordial chaos entity Tiamat. The specific cosmological framework it presented, however, did not match any known authentic Sumerian text, and its connection to Lovecraft's work was far too convenient to be anything other than deliberate construction. The Simon Necronomicon nevertheless created its own rich mythology. Its cosmological system described a universe governed by the conflict between 50 ancient ones, primordial forces of chaos and destruction, and the gods of order and creation, led by the Babylonian deity Marduk. It presented the great old ones of Lovecraft's fiction and the chaos monsters of Sumerian mythology as the same entities, viewed through different cultural lenses at different points in history. Within the Simon Necronomicon's framework, the text served as an initiatory manual, a guide through 50 successive levels of spiritual and magical development, each corresponding to one of the ancient ones. A practitioner working through the book was said to progress through these levels by performing specific ritual work at each gate, gaining power and knowledge as they ascended. The system bore structural resemblance to certain legitimate traditions of Western ceremonial magic, which gave it a plausibility that straight fiction would not have had. The entities within the Simon Necronomicon's mythology were presented as genuinely dangerous, not in a theatrical sense, but in the specific sense that working with forces of that age and that nature without adequate preparation was held to be genuinely destabilizing. This, notably, was entirely consistent with what Lovecraft's mythology had always said, that the Necronomicon's contents were not safe for human engagement, regardless of the reader's intentions. The Necronomicon did not emerge from nothing. Lovecraft was a deeply well-read man, and the tradition of the supremely dangerous forbidden text, the grimoire so powerful that its possession marked the owner for destruction, was ancient and genuine long before he wrote a word of fiction. Real historical grimoires that scholars believe influenced Lovecraft's conception of the Necronomicon included the Lemegeton Clavicula Salomonis, commonly known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, a 17th century compilation of earlier material describing the summoning and binding of 72 demons. There was also the Picatrix, an Arabic magical text compiled around the 11th century from older sources, dealing with astral magic and the manipulation of cosmic forces. The Ars Goetia, which formed one part of the Lemegeton, dealt specifically with ceremonial demon summoning in detailed and systematic terms. The concept of knowledge so powerful that it corrupted the seeker was fundamental to all of these traditions. The Book of Abramelin, a 15th century text in which a magician describes receiving direct knowledge from his holy guardian angel, carried explicit warnings about the dangers of the powers it described, and required years of preparation before any practitioner could safely attempt its central operation. The Grand Grimoire, also known as the Red Dragon and sometimes as the Gospel of Satan, was a real European text with a reputation for being so dangerous that copies were burned on sight by the authorities of several countries. Lovecraft synthesized all of this tradition and transformed it. He kept the essential quality, the forbidden knowledge that destroyed its seekers, but stripped away the Christian theological framework within which most European grimoire tradition operated. In its place, he put something far bleaker, a cosmology with no moral center, no redemptive God, no infernal adversary seeking souls, only vast, ancient, indifferent forces, documented by a man who had looked at them long enough to write them down before they consumed him. That transformation, from a universe with moral stakes to a universe of pure cosmic scale and human irrelevance, was Lovecraft's genuine contribution to mythology. And the Necronomicon was the vehicle through which that contribution was most powerfully expressed. H.P. Lovecraft died in Providence, Rhode Island on March 15, 1937, of intestinal cancer at the age of 46. He died poor, largely unpublished in any prestigious forum, and with no real sense of the size of the legacy he was leaving behind. The continuation of the Necronomicon's mythology fell to the writers who had corresponded with Lovecraft during his lifetime and who shared his vision. August Derleth, who co-founded Arkham House Publishing specifically to preserve Lovecraft's work, was perhaps the most significant contributor to the mythology's expansion after Lovecraft's death. Derleth systematized the Cthulhu Mythos, giving it a more organized cosmological structure, adding his own stories and encouraging other writers to contribute to the shared universe. Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and Robert Bloch all contributed stories that referenced or expanded upon the Necronomicon's mythology. Bloch, who would later write Psycho, was a close correspondent of Lovecraft's, and wrote stories set within the Cthulhu Mythos that added texture to the legend of the book and its consequences. By the mid-20th century, the Necronomicon had achieved something genuinely remarkable. It had convinced a significant portion of its readers that it was real. Letters arrived at universities, including real universities, not just Miskatonic, asking how to obtain a copy of the Necronomicon. The fiction had become, in the minds of many readers, something that could not possibly be merely fiction, because the mythology surrounding it was simply too detailed, too internally consistent, and too convincingly ancient in its feel. This effect, the blurring of fiction and reality through the sheer weight of elaboration, was, arguably, the Necronomicon's most remarkable power. And so we arrive at the end of the Necronomicon's story, though end is perhaps the wrong word for a mythology that has consistently resisted ending. Abdul Alhazred wrote his book and was devoured by what he had studied. The book survived him, and every attempt to destroy it. It crossed languages, centuries, and continents. It was condemned by the Greek Patriarch and the Pope. It passed through the hands of scholars and sorcerers and madmen. It crossed from the fiction of a quiet, impoverished writer in Providence into the private obsessions of thousands of real people, and from there into the broader waters of modern mythology, where it continues to move. Whether one encounters the Necronomicon as literature, as mythology, as the foundation of a genuine occult tradition, or simply as one of the most successful pieces of world-building in the history of storytelling, it rewards attention. Its ideas are deep. Its lore is internally rich. Its warnings are consistent, and, if taken seriously, even metaphorically, meaningful. There are kinds of knowledge that the human mind was not built to contain. There are questions, if you pursue them too single-mindedly, that do not leave you as you were when you began. That is the Necronomicon's oldest and truest lesson, the one Alhazred paid with his life to put on paper, and that all the scholars and sorcerers who followed him paid something to learn as well. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If this episode moved you, intrigued you, or gave you something to think about, please share it with someone who would appreciate it. We would love to have you join us again for the next episode in this series, where we continue our journey through the darker corners of world mythology. Until then, seek knowledge carefully, because some of it has teeth.